Hey guys! Tonight, we step into the shadows of ancient Rome's darkest justice. A punishment so brutal and dehumanizing that you probably won't survive the horror of it. Even just in imagination, you find yourself standing in a dusty Roman street. The sun baking the stones. The air thick with fear and anticipation. Slaves and rebels, the empire's most despised, are about to face a death designed not just to kill, but to humiliate and terrorize. Crucifixion, or crucifixio, as the Romans called it, is more than execution. It's a public warning, etched in wood and flesh. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's strangely comforting to see who's out there traveling with me through time. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're watching from the edge of an empire obsessed with order, control, and ruthless punishment. Crucifixion is reserved for those at the bottom of Roman society: slaves, criminals, and anyone daring enough to rebel. It's a spectacle of cruelty, engineered to terrify not just the victim, but everyone else. Picture a rough wooden cross or stake, nails hammered through wrists or ankles, and the slow, agonizing death by exposure, dehydration, and suffocation. This wasn't quick. It was designed to drag on. Historians still argue whether crucifixion was a common everyday punishment or an exceptional terror used sparingly for major threats. What's certain is that it was the ultimate tool to crush rebellion and maintain the empire's iron grip. It's a chilling reminder that justice in Rome was as much about sending a message as it was about law. You might have heard of crucifixion only in the context of one famous victim, but its legacy was far wider, affecting countless souls who lived in fear of the cross. Tonight, we peel back the layers of this grim tradition to understand its meaning, mechanics, and terrifying impact. Ready? Let's start at the beginning. You trudge alongside a caravan of condemned slaves, their chains rattling and faces hollow. These people are seen as less than human property to be used and discarded. The state decides their fate, and crucifixion is the worst sentence imaginable. It's a punishment wrapped in public spectacle, cruelty, and a slow death designed to break body and spirit alike. It's hard not to imagine the smell of sweat, blood, and wood smoke mingling in the hot Roman air. The crowd's murmurs shifting between morbid curiosity and nervous fear. For the Romans, this was not just justice, it was theater. A grim pageant designed to remind everyone who held power and who could be crushed like insects. Even in the noise and horror, you catch fragments of ancient debates. Historians still wrestle with how often crucifixion really happened and how different social classes viewed this fate. What's clear, though, is that crucifixion wasn't just about death. It was about dehumanization, terror, and control. Remember, you're not just learning history tonight. You're stepping into a world where justice was brutal and swift, and mercy was a stranger. As the sun sets on this grim tableau, prepare to witness the darkest edges of Roman law and society. You walk with the weight of history on your shoulders, tracing the gruesome origins of crucifixion long before the Romans perfected their cruel version. Imagine yourself not in Rome, but in ancient Persia, Carthage, and even Phoenicia, where early empires first devised this barbaric punishment, it wasn't a Roman invention, no. They borrowed and adapted, turning crucifixion into a systematic tool of terror. The earliest records tell of enemies and slaves nailed or tied to wooden structures and left to die under the blistering sun or freezing nights. For these ancient peoples, crucifixion was less about lawful justice and more about savage retribution. The Romans inherited this practice and refined it into an efficient machine for suppressing dissent and maintaining order. Imagine the cultural cocktail, a barbaric method, polished by Roman military discipline and legal precision. Historians still argue whether the Romans picked up crucifixion from the Carthaginians during the Punic Wars or from Eastern influences. The truth might be a tangled web of exchanges across the Mediterranean. A grisly cultural borrowing born from conquest and fear. By the time crucifixion became entrenched in Roman law, it had acquired a terrifying reputation. It wasn't just death, it was a public statement. A ritualized method to disgrace the condemned, strip them of all humanity, and display their suffering as a warning to others. You'd hear whispers in the market. If you dare rise up, this will be your fate. This ancient punishment's roots reveal much about how civilizations understood power and control. Crucifixion was a statement: the state holds your life and your dignity. It's a message hammered and nailed into the bodies of those who dared to defy. As you imagine the spread of this method through ancient empires, picture the crude wooden crosses standing on dusty hilltops. The victims stretched and gasping. The crowds gathered to witness the ultimate assertion of dominance. The chilling consistency of this practice across cultures hints at a universal human cruelty, dressed in different garbs, but with the same brutal core. So, before Rome adopted crucifixion, it was already a symbol of utter defeat, suffering, and humiliation. The Romans, with their love of law and spectacle, gave it a systematized, chilling new life. Remember this lineage. The roots of crucifixion stretch back deeper and darker than most realize. A shadow cast long before the empire's rise. Now, you step deeper into the legal maze of Rome, where crucifixion wasn't a haphazard cruelty, but a punishment enshrined by law, reserved for the most despised among society. Picture yourself in a crowded Roman court. The judges in their togas, voices echoing with authority, determining who deserves death by the cross. Roman law was famously detailed, but also brutally hierarchical. Free citizens rarely faced crucifixion. It was reserved mainly for slaves, rebellious provincials, pirates, and traitors. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest legal code, explicitly outlawed crucifixion for Roman citizens who were entitled to dignified executions like beheading. You can almost hear the murmurs from the plebs. If you're not a citizen, your life is worth less. It's a harsh reality. Your social status directly decided how you'd die. Slaves were property, and property could be destroyed publicly to serve as warning. Historians still argue about the exact legal procedures for sentencing crucifixion. But what's clear is that it was always a tool for suppressing threats to the state's stability. Rebels, especially those who led slave revolts or provincial uprisings, were prime candidates for this grisly fate. The law functioned not just to punish the individual, but to maintain the empire's delicate order. The cross wasn't merely a tool for death. It was a legal instrument wielded to instill fear in those who might challenge Rome's authority. Your mind drifts to the darker corners of the Forum, imagining slaves brought forth in chains, their pleas ignored, their fate sealed by law. Crucifixion was the empire's answer to dissent absolute, public, and irreversible. And yet, the law had its contradictions. Roman governors sometimes hesitated to order crucifixions because the spectacle could stir sympathy or unrest among the populace. Even in cruelty, there was calculation. Legal experts debated the appropriateness of crucifixion for certain crimes. Was it right to crucify a rebellious slave but not a citizen? This distinction both reflected and reinforced Rome's rigid social hierarchy. So, as you imagine the harsh Roman courtroom, remember that crucifixion was as much about law and social order as it was about pain and death. It was the empire's ultimate tool to remind everyone where they stood and how far Rome would go to keep control. You now find yourself among the trembling ranks of slaves. The primary victims of crucifixion in Roman society. Envision the daily life of these men and women shackled, beaten, and stripped of rights. Their bodies and souls owned outright by masters and the state alike. For them, crucifixion was the ultimate threat hanging over their heads, a grim punctuation mark on a life already marked by suffering. Slaves were commodities, and like broken tools, they could be discarded violently. The fear of crucifixion was a method of control woven deeply into the fabric of slavery. A slave who dared to run, Rebel, or resist knew the penalty was death, slow, public, and humiliating. Historians still argue whether all rebellious slaves faced crucifixion, or if it was reserved for the leaders and the most dangerous. What's certain is that after the bloody Spartacus rebellion, the spectacle of crucifixion became a brutal message for anyone dreaming of freedom. Imagine the Appian Way stretching for miles, lined with hundreds of crosses bearing the bodies of captured rebels. It was a grim reminder of Rome's reach and ruthlessness. Yet, crucifixion wasn't just about punishment, it was psychological warfare. By turning slaves into living warnings, Rome maintained its social order without constant warfare. Oddly, some slave owners reportedly used the threat of crucifixion so effectively that actual executions became rare. Fear was a sharper weapon than nails and wood. You might wonder, did any slaves ever escape this fate? Stories circulate of desperate escapes and near miracles. But these were exceptions, often drowned in myth. To the free Roman citizen, a slave's death by crucifixion was just another day of justice. To the slave, it was a nightmare looming over every step. This grim dynamic shaped much of Roman society's dark underbelly, where control depended on terror and spectacle. And the cross was a constant, dreadful reminder of power. As you breathe in the dust of those ancient roads, imagine the weight of so many broken lives stretched across those wooden frames, caught forever between history and horror. You walk into the tense world of Roman politics, where crucifixion isn't just a punishment, it's a political weapon. The empire was a colossal machine, fueled by fear, and rebels or insurgents weren't just lawbreakers. They were threats to the very order keeping Rome on top. To the ruling class, crucifixion was the ultimate statement: defy Rome. And this is the price. Imagine provincial towns where whispers of rebellion stirred like wildfire. Roman governors, often far from the city's control, wielded crucifixion as both sword and shield. They hung bodies along roadsides to remind restless subjects who held the power. Political rebels were branded criminals, but their deaths were spectacles staged to deter whole populations. You'd see captives nailed and tied to crosses, their faces gaunt and twisted in pain. a tableau of warning to anyone dreaming of uprising. Historians still debate whether crucifixion was used more for political control than for regular criminal punishment. Some argue it was less frequent, but always politically charged. Remember the slave rebellions? Especially the one led by Spartacus. When thousands of rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, it was less about justice and more about sending a terrifying message: Rome is merciless. Yet, the decision to crucify wasn't always straightforward. Political leaders had to weigh the risk of inciting sympathy or rebellion against the benefits of brutal deterrence. Sometimes, mercy or alternative punishments were chosen to avoid stirring unrest. The cross, in these cases, was less about punishment and more about spectacle. A public theater of power. The sight of crucified rebels served as a warning etched in blood, saying, "This is what happens when you challenge Rome." So, as you stand among the crowd, you feel the heavy air of political tension mingling with fear and fascination. Crucifixion was more than death. It was control writ large. A dark symbol of Rome's grip on its empire. Step closer now to the physical reality of crucifixion itself. You can almost feel the rough splinters of the wooden cross digging into your skin as you imagine the condemned strapped or nailed to it. The anatomy of a crucifixion is both brutal and precise, designed to prolong agony and humiliation. The victim's arms were typically stretched wide, either nailed through the wrists or tied with ropes. Feet could be nailed separately or together. The cross itself wasn't always the classic shape we imagine. Sometimes it was a simple stake or a T-shaped beam. Pain was just the beginning. The body hung suspended, causing muscles to cramp painfully as the victim struggled to breathe. Each breath was a fight. The chest muscles strained to push air into lungs weighted down by their own weight. Imagine being left exposed to sun, wind, and insects. Your skin blistering and eyes burning. Dehydration setting quickly, and the slow loss of blood from nail wounds added to the weakness. Historians still argue about the exact positioning of nails. Were they through the palms or wrists? Modern forensic studies suggest the palms couldn't support the body's weight, so wrists were likely used. Though the historical record isn't conclusive, executioners had a grim routine, sometimes offering minimal water or a bitter vinegar drink, but mostly leaving victims to die slowly. Some victims lasted days. This method wasn't just about death, it was about suffering. A prolonged ordeal designed to crush spirit and serve as a public spectacle of power and terror. As you picture the condemned struggling for each breath, you realize crucifixion was a masterclass in cruelty, methodical, calculated, and terrifyingly effective. The executioners weren't sadists by nature, but soldiers following orders. Their efficiency, a chilling reminder of how normalized such brutality was. You might recall the stories of a quick death by breaking legs. But often, that mercy was withheld to prolong the spectacle. Remember this: anatomy as we continue crucifixion was designed to maximize agony and terror. An execution method born of dark efficiency. Now, you follow the condemned on the final leg of their journey from sentencing to the wooden cross where death awaits. The process was both ritual and spectacle. A grim march into oblivion. First, the victim was stripped naked, their clothes ripped away to expose vulnerability and shame. Then came the public humiliation, whipping, mockery, and jeers from the crowd. You hear the clatter of chains and the harsh commands of soldiers as they bind or nail the condemned to the cross. The nails weren't quick. Hammering was deliberate to cause maximum pain. The cross was then lifted, or the condemned hoisted into place, suspended for all to see. Imagine the victim's body sagging under its own weight. Muskeln screaming. The struggle for breath becoming desperate. Crowds gathered. Some out of fear. Others out of grim curiosity. Vendors might sell food nearby, while children gawked, perhaps learning early about power and punishment. Sometimes, executioners guarded the site to prevent interference or rescue attempts. The condemned was left to die publicly. A living warning. Historians still argue about how much ritual accompanied crucifixion were their prayers, curses, or symbolic acts by soldiers or priests. Evidence is scarce. But Roman culture loved spectacle. So, a ritualized atmosphere seems likely. You might picture the journey along the Via Appia, where hundreds of crosses bore the bodies of Spartacus's defeated rebels. A macabre parade of Rome's dominance. This procession wasn't just punishment. It was psychological warfare on a grand scale. As the sun blazed down, the condemned hung for hours or days. Their suffering, a grim lesson etched into the empire's collective memory. Watching this, you realize crucifixion was more than execution. It was a carefully choreographed statement of power, pain, and public order. You step into the uneasy mix of horror and fascination that filled the Roman streets during a crucifixion. Imagine the crowd gathered at the execution site, a chaotic blend of curiosity, dread, and brutal entertainment. This public spectacle was not just about justice. It was about keeping the empire's grip tight through fear. The scene is vivid. Vendors hawk food and drinks. Children tug at their parents' hands. And soldiers stand watch, ensuring the show goes on uninterrupted. The condemned hangs, their suffering laid bare for all to see. A living reminder of what happens to those who defy Rome. Crowds might murmur prayers, cast stones, or whisper stories of mercy and vengeance. You hear gasps when a victim convulses or a breath escapes. Some may feel sympathy. Others relish the spectacle. This blend of terror and voyeurism is a hallmark of Roman justice. Public executions were a mix of punishment, deterrence, and social theater, designed to impress upon everyone that the law was absolute and cruelty was a tool of control. Historians still argue about how crowds reacted. Were there moments of genuine compassion? Or was it pure spectacle? The truth likely varies by place and time, but the message was clear. The cross was a grim stage for Rome's power. You can't help but notice how the spectacle normalized violence, turning suffering into public spectacle. The lines between justice and cruelty blur as the crowd watches silently or jeers. Their reactions, a mirror of the empire's heart. Remember that uneasy feeling? Next time you hear about ancient justice, it was often as much about the audience as the accused. The crowd was both witness and participant in this ritual of power. The agony you imagine now goes beyond physical pain. Crucifixion was a slow death, with torment lingering for hours or even days. The victim's body suffered in agonizing ways that modern medicine has only begun to understand. Breathing became a torture. Hanging by the arms made it hard to expand the chest. And victims had to push up with their nailed feet just to gasp air. Muscle cramps, dehydration, and blood loss added layers of torment. You feel the relentless sun beating down, drying out wounds and blistering skin. Flies swarm around exposed flesh. The victim's vision blurs. Delirium sets in as exhaustion and shock take over. Historians still argue about the average time it took to die. Some suggest death could come within hours. Others, that it dragged on for days. Either way, the agony was immense. Interestingly, some sources mention that the condemned might receive a bitter drink of vinegar or sour wine. A cruel mockery of mercy. It did little to ease suffering, but perhaps prolonged consciousness for the spectacle. Pain wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The victim was exposed, humiliated, and helpless. The mind often wandered between consciousness and oblivion. Desperate for relief that never came. Crucifixion was designed to maximize this torment, ensuring the victim's body and spirit were broken before death. It wasn't just execution, it was a prolonged ordeal of horror. Imagine the crowd witnessing this slow demise, the mixture of pity, horror, or sometimes cruel satisfaction must have been overwhelming. This physical and psychological horror cemented crucifixion as the empire's most dreaded punishment. An experience so terrifying that even the thought of it could break willpower. Shift your gaze now to the soldiers who carried out crucifixions. Grim professionals caught between duty and cruelty. These executioners were rarely fanatics. More often, they were disciplined. Roman soldiers performing a routine task. Imagine the clash of hammer on nail, the pulling tight of ropes, and the callous efficiency with which the condemned were prepared. To these men, crucifixion was a job, a grim necessity to maintain order. Soldiers were trained to perform executions quickly but thoroughly, aware that mistakes could incite chaos. They guarded the sites, preventing rescues or interference. Historians still debate whether executioners showed any personal cruelty or if their actions were strictly procedural. Some accounts suggest moments of mockery. But overall, they were instruments of the state. Interestingly, the soldiers sometimes offered the condemned minimal mercy water, vinegar, or a quick death by breaking legs. But these acts were rare and often politically motivated. You might imagine the psychological toll on these men. Though for many, the brutality became routine. Their detachment was part of how Rome sustained its vast and often ruthless empire. The soldiers' presence was a reminder that crucifixion was an official act, not just random cruelty. It was sanctioned and controlled. A state ritual enacted with military precision. Their role blurred the line between justice and violence, making them both agents of law and symbols of Rome's iron will. So, as you picture those soldiers hammering nails and hoisting crosses, remember, they were cogs in a machine that turned cruelty into order. Their hands, carrying out the empire's darkest commands. You're now invited to explore the variations of crucifixion itself, because the Romans, ever the practical empire, didn't settle on just one method. The image of a cross shaped like a is iconic, but the reality was messier and more diverse. There was the crux simplex, a simple upright stake driven into the ground. Sometimes, condemned souls were tied or nailed directly to these stakes. Left to hang in the blistering sun or the biting cold? Imagine a lonely figure, stretched out against a bare post, visible for miles. A stark monument of shame and suffering. Then came the crux commissa, or the T-shaped cross, which looked like an uppercase T. The victim's arms were spread wide along the horizontal beam, making escape or rest impossible. The most famous, the crux emissa, shaped like the classic, had a vertical beam longer than the horizontal. This design allowed the cross to be carried to the execution site before being erected, turning the condemned's journey into a humiliating procession. Historians still argue about how common each form was. Some suggest the Romans used whatever was handy, while others think there was symbolism in the shapes used for certain crimes or classes of victims. The methods also varied in how the condemned were affixed. Nails were the most brutal and permanent, but ropes were sometimes used, especially if the goal was to prolong suffering or humiliation. Remember those soldiers hammering nails? Their choices impacted the victim's agony and how long they'd survive. For instance, nailing through wrists instead of palms was necessary to support weight, but also increased pain and damage. In some cases, victims were crucified, lying down an almost merciful variation to hasten death. In others, they were suspended for days, a prolonged nightmare. You might imagine a macabre workshop of execution styles, each chosen to serve a grim purpose: deterrence, punishment, or a spectacle. As you picture these crosses, varying in form and function, remember that crucifixion wasn't one size fits all. It was a brutal toolkit adapted by a ruthless empire to enforce its will. Now, let's consider the psychological warfare crucifixion inflicted not only on victims, but on the entire Roman populace. The cross wasn't merely a tool for death. It was a symbol designed to terrorize, humiliate, and dominate. You're standing in a Roman market square, looking up at a hill where crosses bear the bodies of the condemned. The sight is stark naked. Broken men and women. Faces twisted in pain. Silent witnesses to what happens when power is challenged. The message is clear: obey or suffer the ultimate disgrace. Crucifixion served to instill fear in slaves, rebels, and even free citizens contemplating rebellion. It was less about justice for the individual and more about controlling the many. This spectacle was carefully calculated. Execution sites were chosen for maximum visibility along roads, near city gates, or on hillsides. The slow death ensured prolonged terror. Historians still argue how effective this terror really was. Did crowds turn away in horror? Or did the spectacle desensitize them? Were there murmurs of dissent beneath the fear? The answers are murky. But fear clearly played a central role. The psychological impact extended beyond the living. Families of victims were shamed, and communities warned. It was a social weapon as much as a legal one. Interestingly, some condemned were left on crosses after death, scavenged by animals or left to rot, intensifying the humiliation. This sustained public display turned crucifixion into a theater of power, a grim performance reminding all who watched that Rome's justice was absolute and brutal. You might think this kind of terror is a thing of the past, but remember, symbols of fear and control still echo through history. So as you gaze at those crosses, imagine the invisible chains of fear binding an entire empire, forged not just in law, but in the deep psychological impact of suffering on display. It's time to reflect on what crucifixion destroyed beyond the body, the victim's dignity, identity, and hope. Death by the cross was not just a physical end, it was an obliteration of personhood. Imagine being dragged naked through crowded streets, your face exposed to mockery and scorn. The chains that bind you aren't just metal, They are social shackles that strip you of humanity. Crucifixion forced victims into the ultimate loss, the loss of self. The public nature of the execution meant friends and family witnessed the fall from person to spectacle. Your name, your story, your very existence reduced to a cautionary tale. Historians still debate how victims were remembered or forgotten. Did any survive in stories beyond the cross? Or were they consigned to oblivion? The answer varies. But, for many, crucifixion marked erasure. In some cases, the condemned's status as slave or rebel made this erasure easier. Their deaths were expected to erase not only their lives, but their legacies. This destruction of identity was a key element in Rome's control. By turning people into objects of horror, the empire reaffirmed its dominance. Yet, paradoxically, some crucified victims became symbols of resistance or martyrdom, their suffering inspiring tales long after death. You might think crucifixion was solely about pain, but it was also about breaking spirits and silencing voices. As you imagine the condemned's final moments, stripped of all but suffering, remember that crucifixion was a weapon of psychological annihilation as much as physical. The cross erased not just lives, but the very essence of what it meant to be human under Roman rule. Step into the complex world of Roman religious and cultural attitudes, where crucifixion sat uneasily with ideas of honor, citizenship, and piety. You might assume Romans accepted this punishment without question, but it was, in fact, deeply stigmatized, especially for free citizens. In Roman culture, honor was everything. A Roman citizen's dignity was protected by law, and dying by crucifixion was considered a fate worse than death, an unbearable disgrace. The 12 Tables explicitly forbade crucifixion for citizens, reserving it for slaves and enemies of the state. Imagine a Roman noble turning up their nose at the very idea, convinced it was a punishment only fit for barbarians. Yet, the cross remained a constant shadow in Roman society, a reminder of who was outside the privileged circle. It symbolized ultimate dishonor, reserved for those stripped of citizenship, status, and rights. To be crucified was to be publicly declared an outcast, a non-person. Historians still debate how this cultural tension played out in everyday life. Did Romans see crucifixion as necessary evil? Or was it a reviled practice? Some sources suggest a mixture of disgust and acceptance, depending on context and class. Religion also played a part. Crucifixion was not a ritual sacrifice or holy death. It was profane, brutal, and deeply shameful. Victims were denied traditional burial rites, adding spiritual torment to physical suffering. You might recall that early Christians later reinterpreted crucifixion's symbolism, but for most Romans, it was a mark of disgrace and failure. This cultural framing shaped not only who was crucified, but how society viewed justice and punishment. Crucifixion was a tool for excluding and degrading those deemed unworthy. As you stand amidst Roman crowds, you feel the palpable line drawn between citizen and slave, honor and disgrace, life and humiliation. The cross was more than wood and nails. It was a cultural scar on the empire's face, a mark that defined and divided. You now meet some of the notable figures whose crucifixions echoed through history as powerful political messages. Beyond the nameless victims, a few condemned souls' deaths became infamous, their crosses turning into symbols of defiance or control. Imagine a rebel leader captured after a failed uprising, dragged through the streets and nailed to a cross along a major Roman road. His death wasn't just punishment, it was a spectacle meant to crush resistance and warn others. The Spartacus rebellion is a prime example. After crushing the revolt, Rome crucified an estimated 6,000 captured slaves along the Appian Way. The mass execution sent a thunderous warning that the empire would respond with overwhelming force to any challenge. Other political enemies, pirates, and traitors met similar fates. Their names whispered with fear. These crucifixions were political theater, staged for maximum psychological impact. Historians still argue about the extent to which these high-profile crucifixions were publicized or hidden. Some suggest the empire sometimes downplayed such spectacles to avoid unrest, while others see them as essential. One curious tidbit: some emperors used crucifixion selectively to intimidate but not alienate key populations. It was a careful balance of terror and politics. You might recall the story of a certain Jewish preacher crucified under Pontius Pilate. Though not politically powerful, his death became one of history's most enduring symbols, transforming crucifixion into a spiritual icon. These famous crucifixions remind us that behind every brutal act was a message about power, control, and who ruled the world. As you envision those crosses lined up like grim sentinels, remember, they marked more than death. They marked history. Historians have long debated how frequently crucifixion was actually practiced in the Roman world. Was it an everyday punishment? Or, a rare, terrifying exception? The truth isn't simple. You step into a dusty library, surrounded by scrolls and fragments of ancient texts. Some writers, like Josephus and Seneca, describe crucifixion as a common fate for slaves and rebels. Other sources hint at its rarity, suggesting it was reserved for the most serious threats. Archaeological evidence is sparse but telling. A few skeletal remains show nail holes and trauma consistent with crucifixion. But such finds are rare. This scarcity fuels debates about how widespread the practice really was. Some scholars argue that crucifixion's gruesome spectacle made it impractical as a routine punishment. It was expensive, time-consuming, and risked stirring sympathy or unrest among the populace. Others suggest that crucifixion was common in provinces and during times of rebellion, but less so in Rome itself, reflecting differing local practices and political climates. You might recall that the famous mass crucifixion of Spartacus's followers was an extreme case, not the everyday norm. This scholarly debate shows that crucifixion wasn't a static practice, but evolved with Rome's shifting political and social needs. It also highlights how much of history is reconstructed from fragmentary evidence, leaving room for mystery and interpretation. So, as you navigate this tangled historical debate, remember that crucifixion's frequency is part of a larger puzzle about power, punishment, and the Roman world's darker corners. The cross was both a tool of terror and a rare spectacle. Its use shaped by politics, practicality, and fear. Now you're plunging into the murky world of escape myths and rare miracles surrounding crucifixion. History and legend intertwine, blurring the line between fact and fiction. As stories of desperate escapes from the cross captivate the imagination, picture the condemned struggling against their bonds. Some said to have slipped ropes or nails, slipping free from the torturous grip of the wooden frame. These tales circulate among the fearful and hopeful alike, spreading like wildfire through the markets and taverns. But how much truth do they hold? Historians still argue whether such escapes were even possible or simply wishful thinking, born of human resilience. and the desire for hope amid despair. Consider that crucifixion was designed to be inescapable. Victims were nailed, tied, and guarded. Executioners ensured the condemned were secured tightly, often with soldiers stationed nearby to prevent rescue. Yet, some accounts hint at miracles or early removals by sympathizers. For instance, religious texts and folklore sometimes describe believers rescuing victims or witnessing divine intervention. One quirky tidbit comes from a Roman satirist mocking a supposedly miraculous escape that turned out to be a drunken prisoner's muddled tale. Whether fact or fiction, these stories underscore the deep human yearning to defy death and injustice. Think about the psychological power of these escape myths. They offered comfort and defiance in the face of overwhelming cruelty, reminding people that even in the darkest moments, hope could flicker. The truth, however, was grim. Escape from crucifixion was almost impossible, and the rare stories likely served more to inspire than to inform. So, as you imagine those desperate struggles against wood and iron, remember that myth and reality dance closely, each shaping how crucifixion was remembered and feared. The cross was a trap designed to hold its prey firmly, but human hope and legend sometimes found cracks in its cruel wood. You now venture into the shadowy and less discussed territory of female crucifixion, an area where history blurs into controversy and scarce records spark debate. It's easy to imagine crucifixion as exclusively a punishment for men, slaves, and rebels. But rare accounts suggest women sometimes suffered this brutal fate too, raising questions about gender, punishment, and power in ancient Rome. Picture a woman condemned by Roman courts, her crime likely considered especially scandalous or threatening. Was she a rebellious slave? A political agitator? Or a woman who defied social norms so severely that the state sought to make an example of her? The answers are elusive, because few explicit records survivent. Historians still argue whether female crucifixion was an exceptional anomaly or a more common, but underreported occurrence. Roman society's deeply patriarchal nature often relegated women's stories to the margins, and legal texts rarely address their punishments in detail. One fringe but fascinating tidbit involves the alleged crucifixion of women during certain slave revolts. Though the evidence is fragmentary and debated, some scholars suggest these accounts may be exaggerated or symbolic, reflecting societal fears more than actual events. The Roman legal system did differentiate punishments by gender, with women sometimes spared the harshest penalties. But cruelty wasn't unknown to cross gender lines when political expediency demanded it. Imagine the psychological horror compounded by gender-based humiliation. Crucifixion stripped women not only of life, but of the limited protections offered by their social status. This topic raises broader questions about how Roman law, gender, and violence intersected in one of history's most brutal punishments. Despite the scarcity of sources, female crucifixion challenges us to reconsider assumptions about who suffered and why. Expanding the narrative beyond the typical male-centered lens, as you picture a lone woman on a cross, surrounded by jeering crowds. Think about how this act symbolized the empire's ruthless determination to control all who threatened its order, regardless of gender. The cross, in this rare and terrifying context, was a stage for ultimate humiliation and control, breaking not just bodies but societal norms. Now, you step into the profound impact crucifixion had on early Christianity, a legacy that transformed this brutal punishment into a symbol of faith, sacrifice, and hope. The cross, once a sign of disgrace and terror in Roman eyes, became a central emblem for a new religion, spreading quietly through the empire's shadows. Imagine the early Christian communities, small and often persecuted, gathering in secret. To them, crucifixion was not merely death, it was the death of their founder, Jesus of Nazareth, a man whose execution by crucifixion was meant to be humiliating and final. Instead, it became a powerful story of redemption and resurrection. Historians still argue about how early Christians interpreted crucifixion and how it shaped their theology. Did the brutal reality of the cross inspire a message of hope through suffering? Or did the spiritual significance grow more gradually over time? Interestingly, the cross's symbolism was initially so taboo that early Christians often avoided public display of it, fearing persecution. Over centuries, however, it evolved into a potent icon, signifying not only suffering, but ultimate victory over death and sin. This transformation is a profound example of how cultural meaning can be reclaimed and inverted. A symbol of Roman cruelty became a beacon of faith and endurance. Quirky though it may seem, some early Christian texts describe the crucified Jesus speaking to his followers after death, reinforcing the idea that the cross was a gateway to salvation, not just an instrument of torture. This reimagining of crucifixion affected how Christians viewed suffering, martyrdom, and even justice itself. The cross, once the height of humiliation, was now a source of strength and identity. Imagine the tension this created in Roman society, an empire proud of its power and law, confronted by a movement that embraced the very symbol of its most brutal execution method. Crucifixion, through Christianity, found new life as a symbol of hope, forever altering the meaning of the cross in history and culture. As you ponder this, you realize how a tool of oppression was transformed into a universal emblem of resilience and faith. Now, picture yourself comparing crucifixion with other brutal Roman punishments. Because crucifixion wasn't the only grisly method Rome employed to enforce law and order. Each punishment carried its own meaning and place in the social hierarchy, reflecting Rome's complex attitudes toward crime, class, and control. Consider burning at the stake, a fiery death reserved for arsonists, heretics, and sometimes slaves guilty of serious offenses. Flames licked flesh, and death was often agonizingly slow. Like crucifixion, it was both execution and spectacle, designed to purify or punish publicly. Then there was beheading, a swift and honorable death, mostly for Roman citizens or elites. It spared them prolonged suffering, preserving dignity even in death. Think of it as the empire's noble method compared to the slow horrors faced by slaves and rebels. Exile and forced labor were also common punishments. Lengthy sentences in harsh conditions rather than immediate death. These reflected Rome's preference sometimes for removing threats without spectacle. Historians still debate the social messaging behind these punishments. Was crucifixion deliberately chosen to amplify humiliation for the lowest classes? The answer seems yes. The empire used the cruelty ladder as a way to reinforce status. A quirky detail: some criminals were sewn into animal skins and thrown into the sea, a symbolic burial with beasts, signifying utter disgrace. The Romans were masters of using punishment as layered language. Comparing crucifixion to these methods shows that Roman justice was a mix of calculated cruelty and social theater, each punishment sending a different message to different audiences. You might think of crucifixion as the empire's brutal trademark slow. public, and excruciating. Other punishments filled roles that balanced justice, deterrence, and social hierarchy. As you absorb this spectrum of punishment, you see how Rome wielded its legal system like a scalpel and a hammer, precise where needed, brutally overwhelming elsewhere. The empire's vast reach depended on such nuanced cruelty, keeping millions in line through fear, a spectacle, and sometimes grim mercy. Now, imagine yourself standing on the dusty plains of a Roman province during one of the empire's most terrifying slave rebellions, the kind that sent shockwaves through Rome itself. These uprisings were not mere skirmishes, but full-scale wars challenging the very foundations of Roman control. Crucifixion became a grim hallmark of Rome's brutal response. You can almost hear the clash of swords and the rallying cries of thousands of slaves driven by desperation and hope. The most famous, of course, was the revolt led by Spartacus in the 1st century BCE. After their defeat, the Romans crucified approximately 6,000 captured slaves along the Appian Way, a horrifying display stretching for miles. This mass crucifixion was less about individual justice and more about collective punishment, a spectacle designed to terrify and dissuade future rebellions. Imagine those crosses lined up like a ghastly forest, bodies swaying in the hot breeze, a constant reminder of Rome's ruthless reach. Historians still debate the exact numbers and details, but there's no doubt the scale was immense and intended to be symbolic. The message was clear: challenge Rome's power, and you face a fate worse than death. The use of crucifixion in these rebellions highlights its dual role as both punishment and political tool. It wasn't just about killing the insurgents, but about sending a chilling signal to anyone harboring rebellious thoughts. Interestingly, some slaves who escaped crucifixion went on to become symbols of resistance and freedom in later folklore, their stories inspiring generations. As you stand on that grim battlefield, feel the weight of countless lives broken and bodies displayed, an empire asserting dominance through terror and spectacle. This moment in history shows crucifixion's terrifying potency, not just as an execution method, but as a psychological weapon wielded on a massive scale. It's a stark reminder that I-4, Rome. Maintaining order sometimes meant painting entire roads red with the blood of rebellion. Now, you step into the corridors of Roman legal reform and evolving attitudes toward crucifixion, where laws shifted, and the empire grappled with balancing cruelty and order. The story of crucifixion isn't static. It changes as Rome's society, politics, and morals evolve. Imagine Roman senators debating laws that govern punishment, discussing when to use crucifixion, who should be spared, and how to maintain order without provoking unrest. The 12 Tables had set some early guidelines, but over centuries, interpretations and applications varied. By the late Republic and early Empire, some emperors began to restrict crucifixion's use, partly due to its extreme brutality, and partly because of shifting political climates. For example, under Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, crucifixion was officially abolished as a form of capital punishment, influenced by emerging Christian values. Historians still debate how these reforms reflected deeper societal changes. Were they genuine moves toward mercy or strategic shifts to consolidate power? The reforms also affected who could be crucified. Free citizens remained largely protected, but slaves and non-citizens continued to suffer this punishment. It became a marker not only of crime, but of social status. A quirky tidbit: some Roman officials introduced less public executions, fearing crucifixion's spectacle might stir unrest rather than compliance. Secret or private punishments grew in popularity. The decline of crucifixion also mirrors Rome's transformation from a brutal republic to a Christianized empire, reflecting changing attitudes toward justice, punishment, and human dignity. You might picture ancient scrolls detailing these legal shifts, the scribes recording the empire's slow retreat from its cruelest practices. As you imagine these reforms, consider how law is a living thing shaped by politics, culture, and the changing tides of history. The story of crucifixion is thus not just about death, but about Rome's evolving soul, caught between power and humanity. You now journey beyond the heart of Rome, into the vast provinces where crucifixion took on local flavors and meanings, revealing a tapestry of practices shaped by culture, politics, and imperial control. The empire's far-flung edges from Judea to Gaul, from Egypt to Britannia, witnessed crucifixion differently than the streets of the capital. Imagine standing on a dusty provincial road, where a rebel's fate is displayed on a cross. But the crowd's reaction varies. In some places, crucifixion was a well-known terror, a blunt tool to stamp out unrest swiftly. In others, it was a shocking foreign practice, introduced by Roman rulers, stirring resentment and fear. These provincial crucifixions often intersected with local customs and religions in Judea. For example, crucifixion collided with Jewish law and cultural taboos, amplifying its horror. The crucifixion of Jesus is one such moment, a flashpoint where Roman imperial justice met deeply rooted religious identity, sparking centuries of theological reflection. In Egypt, reports suggest crucifixion was sometimes adapted, with victims tied rather than nailed, blending Roman methods with local sensibilities. The exact details are lost in time, but the underlying purpose, public humiliation, and death remained. Historians still debate how widely crucifixion was used outside Italy and whether local authorities ever modified it. Was it a blunt Roman imposition, or a practice gradually integrated into provincial justice? There's also fascinating evidence of crucifixion-like punishments in neighboring cultures, from the Parthians to Germanic tribes, hinting at shared or parallel practices of public capam. Humiliating execution. Imagine the psychological weight on provincial populations, caught between imperial authority and local identity. With crucifixion as a terrifying symbol of foreign domination, archaeological finds like the remains of a crucified man near Jerusalem with nails still embedded give rare, tangible proof that crucifixion wasn't just a Roman myth, but a widespread, brutal reality. This provincial perspective reveals crucifixion as more than a legal punishment. It was an imperial message carved in wood and flesh, echoing across diverse peoples and landscapes. As you wander these distant roads, the cross looms as a stark reminder. No corner of the empire was beyond the reach of Rome's darkest justice. Now, let's delve deeply into the fascinating and rare archaeological evidence that brings crucifixion out of dusty texts and into the realm of tangible reality. For centuries, crucifixion was known mostly through writings, art, and cultural memory. But the physical proof, skeletal remains bearing the scars of this brutal punishment, has been astonishingly scarce, making every discovery a window into an ancient, grisly world. Imagine a team of archaeologists carefully excavating a burial site near Jerusalem, uncovering a single skeleton buried in an unusual posture. Then, upon closer examination, they find a small iron nail still lodged through the heel bone. This extraordinary find, dating to the 1st century CE, provided the first indisputable proof of crucifixion. It wasn't just stories or legends, it was real. Flesh and bone, suffering. This victim, nicknamed the Yehohanan Man, offered a glimpse into the cruel mechanics of crucifixion. The nail's presence in the heel bone confirmed that victims were nailed through their feet. An important detail, long debated by scholars. The unusual burial outside typical Jewish customs hinted at the victim's social status, likely a criminal or rebel. Historians and forensic experts have since studied this skeleton to reconstruct the process of crucifixion, adding scientific clarity to ancient texts. They analyzed how the nails were driven, the body's positioning, and the damage caused by suspension on the cross. Yet, despite the significance, sukhfins remain rare. The conditions required for bones and nails to survive for millennia are extremely specific. This scarcity fuels debates about how often crucifixion occurred. Was it frequent, but bodies disposed of in ways that left no trace? Or was it relatively rare archaeological discoveries elsewhere have uncovered bones with trauma consistent with crucifixion's small holes, fractures, or abnormal positioning? But few have the dramatic clarity of the Yehohanan Man. Each new find challenges historians to reconcile physical evidence with literary sources. For example, some burial sites show victims buried without crosses, suggesting bodies were sometimes removed or hidden. Quirky, yet poignant. Some Roman medical texts even hinted at techniques to hasten death or ease suffering. But these are rare and often contradictory. As you imagine the painstaking work of archaeologists, you appreciate how science peels back millennia to expose the raw reality beneath myth and history. These bones, silent witnesses to agony, remind us that behind every crucifixion was a human life brutally ended. Now, speaking across the ages, through fragments and iron, the archaeological record breathes life into history's shadows, grounding the terrifying legend of the cross in undeniable fact. You now step into the medical and physiological reality of crucifixion, the stark, horrific truth behind what the human body endures when nailed and suspended on a wooden cross. Ancient writers left vivid descriptions, but modern science has finally begun to reconstruct the agonizing physical ordeal. Piece by gruesome piece. Imagine the victim's body arms stretched wide, nails driven through the wrists or palms, feet nailed or tied, muscles screaming as they strain to hold up the crushing weight. The position itself induces intense muscle cramps and exhaustion, forcing constant movement to breathe. Each inhalation agonizing and desperate. Dehydration quickly sets in under the unforgiving sun, while exposure to the elements' heat by day, cold by night, ravages skin and internal organs. The nail wounds cause continuous bleeding and nerve damage, adding layers of searing pain. Historians and medical experts still argue the exact mechanisms of death. Was it primarily from asphyxiation, shock, heart failure, or a combination? Research suggests asphyxiation was a major cause suspended by outstretched arms. The chest muscles tire rapidly, and victims must push up with nailed feet just to inhale. A slow, torturous suffocation. Another key insight is the heart's raw fluid loss from sweating. Bleeding and internal trauma stresses the cardiovascular system. Eventually, the heart weakens and fails. But only after prolonged suffering. You might recall ancient accounts describing victims, sometimes lasting days. A horrifying testament to human endurance amid cruelty. The nails themselves are more than mere instruments. They pierce nerves, bones, and tendons, causing shock and intense localized pain. Recent forensic studies of ancient remains have mapped how the nail's placement maximized agony. An often overlooked factor is the psychological trauma. The victim is fully conscious, exposed to humiliation, isolation, and the knowledge of impending death. Some scholars argue that the crucifixion method was, perversely, a form of slow torture disguised as execution, designed not for swift death, but for maximum terror. Medical reconstructions reveal a body pushed to physiological limits, lungs gasping, muscle sizing, organs shutting down, all while exposed to public gaze. As you imagine this brutal anatomy, you grasp how crucifixion was a carefully engineered nightmare, a blend of physical horror and psychological torment. It was punishment perfected for terror and control, transforming flesh into a canvas of agony. Now you reflect on the psychological terror crucifixion sent rippling through Roman society. Beyond the physical agony of the condemned, the cross was more than wood and nails. It was a chilling symbol woven into the empire's fabric, a tool to instill dread and obedience. Picture a Roman citizen walking near the execution site, eyes catching the swaying form of a crucified rebel or slave. The smell of blood and sweat lingers in the air. The victim's body, torn and exposed, is a living warning etched in flesh. This sight was meant to haunt minds, creating a constant shadow over daily life. The empire's vast majority, especially slaves and provincials, lived with this specter looming. A reminder that defiance meant not just death, but prolonged public humiliation. Historians still debate how effective this terror was. Did it suppress revolts and crimes as intended? Or did it breed resentment and hatred beneath the surface? Likely both fear kept many in line. But oppression also sowed seeds of unrest. The psychological warfare extended to families and communities. Knowing a loved one might suffer crucifixion for rebellion or escape attempts bred caution and submission. Imagine the whispered stories and warnings told to children, "Behave, or this will be your fate." Crucifixion shaped not just law, but social norms and behavior. Roman authorities carefully chose execution sites for maximum visibility, along roads, near city gates, and prominent hills, ensuring the terror was inescapable. This constant psychological pressure was a form of control. As potent as armies or laws, it reinforced power dynamics and hierarchies within society. You might think modern justice systems are harsh, but crucifixion was engineered to break spirits as much as bodies, leaving scars beyond the flesh. As you ponder this, consider how fear functions as a tool of governance. Wielded as sharply as any sword, the cross was both a physical and psychological cage, binding not just the condemned, but the entire society in fear. Now you witness the gradual decline of crucifixion in Roman society, a slow fading of one of history's cruelest punishments, replaced by evolving laws, religious influence, and changing cultural values. Imagine the late Roman Empire, a world shifting beneath its own weight. Christianity is on the rise, bringing new perspectives on suffering, justice, and human dignity. The cross, once a symbol of terror, is now reimagined as an emblem of salvation and hope. In this context, crucifixion's brutality becomes increasingly untenable. Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor, officially banned crucifixion as a capital punishment in the early 4th century CE, marking a profound legal and cultural turning point. Historians still debate how quickly and thoroughly crucifixion disappeared. Some suggest pockets of practice persisted in remote provinces, while others emphasize its near-total abolition. This decline reflects more than law. It marks Rome's transformation from pagan empire to Christianized state, where mercy and sanctity increasingly tempered justice. The abandonment of crucifixion also mirrors changing attitudes toward the body and death. As Christian theology emphasized resurrection and dignity, even in punishment. Yet, the legacy of crucifixion lived on, both physically in memory and symbolically in Christian art and worship. You might imagine former execution sites falling silent, crosses disappearing from roadsides, replaced by churches and altars. The end of crucifixion was a step toward a different justice system, one less about spectacle and terror, and more about legal process and morality. As you stand at this historical crossroads, feel the weight of centuries of suffering, lifting, replaced by a new hope and humanity. The decline of crucifixion signals the empire's evolving soul, moving from fear and control toward faith and compassion. It is a quiet revolution, written not just in laws, but in the hearts of millions. Now, you reflect on the legacy and symbolism of crucifixion, how this ancient punishment transcended its physical horror to become a lasting symbol of suffering, injustice, and ultimately, hope. The wooden cross, once a stark emblem of Roman cruelty, took on a new life, echoing through centuries of art, literature, and culture. Imagine the vast sweep of history, the cross appearing in paintings, sculptures, and stories, each time carrying layers of meaning far beyond its original use. For many, it became a symbol of martyrdom, sacrifice, and redemption. For others, a haunting reminder of oppression and brutality. Crucifixion's legacy is paradoxical. On one hand, it's remembered as the ultimate act of torture and humiliation, a tool of state terror wielded against the powerless. On the other, it was reinterpreted, especially through Christianity, as a symbol of love, sacrifice, and spiritual victory. Historians still debate how much this symbolic transformation influenced society's memory of crucifixion. Did it soften its horror or amplify its significance? The answer likely lies in both. Across cultures and epochs, the cross became a potent emblem, sometimes wielded by the oppressed as a sign of resilience, other times by the powerful as a marker of authority. Its image is woven into the fabric of Western civilization, carrying echoes of pain and hope. A quirky cultural tidbit, the cross even inspired fashion, tattoos, and music, often divorced from its bloody origins, showing how symbols evolve and adapt. As you imagine this journey from brutal execution to spiritual icon, consider how humanity reclaims and reshapes, meaning turning tools of torture into symbols of faith and endurance. The legacy of crucifixion is a testament to the human capacity to find light even in the darkest of shadows. So next time you see a cross, remember its complex history, a symbol born in suffering, but transformed by belief and memory. You now explore modern interpretations and controversies surrounding crucifixion, how today's culture, scholarship and media grapple with representing this ancient punishment and its profound impact, picture a filmmaker recreating a crucifixion scene, wrestling with how to depict the agony authentically without tipping into gratuitous horror, or an artist capturing the cross's dual symbolism, both pain and salvation. Modern historians and theologians debate the accuracy of traditional images when nails really driven through palms or wrists. How long did victims survive? Did women really face crucifixion? These questions spark lively, sometimes heated discussions in academic circles. Pop culture also wrestles with crucifixion's legacy. From blockbuster movies to literature, the cross is portrayed in ways that shape public perception, sometimes accurately, sometimes mythologized or sanitized. Some controversies arise over the depiction of crucifixion in media, balancing respect for its religious significance with historical truth. Others question the potential desensitization to its brutality through repeated portrayal. A quirky, modern twist. Some extreme performance artists have staged crucifixion reenactments, sparking debate about art, suffering, and respect. Medical and forensic advances continue to refine our understanding, challenging long-held assumptions and enriching public knowledge. As you imagine this ongoing dialogue, you see how crucifixion remains alive in collective consciousness, a subject of fascination, reverence, and reflection. Its representation is a mirror reflecting society's evolving relationship with pain, justice, and redemption. So crucifixion continues to haunt and inspire, a powerful symbol bridging past and present, cruelty and hope. Finally, you slow down to reflect deeply on the haunting echoes of crucifixion and what it means for justice and cruelty across time. This ancient punishment was more than death. It was a story about power, fear, humanity, and resistance. Imagine the countless souls who faced the cross, their suffering witnessed by crowds, remembered in whispers or forgotten entirely. Their bodies became stages for a brutal empire's message. But their stories live on as reminders of resilience amid horror. Historians still grapple with understanding crucifixion fully, not just its mechanics, but its place in society and the human psyche. It challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice and power. As you breathe slowly, imagine the fading sunlight, casting long shadows over empty crosses, symbols of a world where cruelty was normalized and fear was law. Yet, within these shadows, there's also light, the capacity for transformation, empathy, and hope that has reshaped crucifixion's meaning over centuries. This reflection isn't just about ancient Rome. It's about our ongoing struggle to balance justice with mercy, power with humanity. The cross teaches us that symbols can evolve, that suffering can inspire, and that memory shapes identity. As you drift toward rest, let the weight of history soften, and the hope of humanity's better nature rise gently. Crucifixion's story is a warning and a lesson, a call to remember, reflect, and choose compassion. Good night, and may your dreams be peaceful beyond the shadows of history. As we close tonight's journey through one of history's darkest punishments, take a moment to breathe deeply and let the weight of these stories settle gently. The cross you've seen was a tool of terror, yes, but also a symbol that changed across time, reminding us how cruelty and hope can intertwine. Remember the faces you imagine: slaves, rebels, women, and nameless souls, each one a human story etched in pain and courage. Their suffering echoes not to glorify cruelty, but to illuminate the resilience of the human spirit. History can be harsh, but it also invites us to reflect on justice, empathy, and the choices we make as societies and individuals. So as you lay down, let the shadows fade and the quiet hum of understanding comfort you. The past is never far, but neither is our capacity for kindness and change. Thank you for traveling with me tonight. Rest well, knowing that even the darkest stories hold the seeds of light.